Take back control. Stop letting algorithms decide your news. Get uncensored history and real knowledge to strengthen your mind, body, and spirit. Watch ad-free content now at ineverknewtv.com preview. I want to say welcome to the legendary Dr. Tommy Curry coming from the UK. Brother Curry, what's going on?
Not much, brother. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm very excited for you to be here. I'm excited as the student to sit and learn. So even though I will be asking the questions, um,
Of
I'm I'm
course.
I'm very excited about taking in the game. Right. We want to get right into things, right? And the first question I wanted to ask is that um, I've been noticing this trend where not just the number one source, but the only source for information
Mhm.
about black men or black males, that is the internet. And I wanted to ask, right, what are the dangers of relying on content creators instead of experts or those with lived experience to understand the conditions influencing black male behavior in America?
Oh man, that's a fantastic question. Being a black male puts you in the unfortunate position of often gaining unwanted and unjustifiable attention from media sources. Newton said that anytime we try to change the image that America has of the black male to something positive, you'll of course be hated. Now, the experts on black men, and we have to be careful how we use that word, but the people who are trying to study black males at a very serious level, who are working with black men, who are interacting with young black boys, who are not using deficit models to talk about them being pathological or them being prone to violence. Those people are going to have vastly different views than what you get, say, from a blog or from everyday internet sources or even internet pundits. There are really two framings that we can kind of point to in general. The first one looks at black men very much as misogynist, violent, aspiring patriarchs who utilize rape, abuse, etc., to gain power. Now, this kind of thinking was popularized during the 1970s and 80s when white feminists, and I want to emphasize that white feminists start analyzing the potential threat that black men had once they were integrated into American society. So you had people like Shulamith Firestone, Susan Brown Miller, Williams and Holmes in their book, The Second Assault, articulate a view of black men that said that black men are driven primarily by their sexuality and deviance be like white men. The piece that's not often talked about is that those white women saw these black men utilizing rape as the way to imitate white male power. So they very much believed that black men were naturally more culturally or biologically prone to rape more than white men. And they're building this not from some kind of random racist idea, but this was the dominant science at the time. Looking at people like Benjamin Mirror's forcible patterns of rape or patterns of forcible rape, they got the idea that, hey, look, black men are going to rape women in their race more than white men rape white women in their race. And because of that, we can say that there's something culturally deficient or deviant about black men and boys that other groups of men don't have to deal with. This kind of thinking was then extended into black feminist historiography. You see this kind of creeping in Michelle Wallace's work. You see this in Jean Noble's work. You see this in Patricia Hill Collins and uh, Kimberly Crenshaw's work, where Kimberly Crenshaw is actually citing the second assault. So what happens now is that that's become the popular pop feminist, pop cultural commentary on black men and boys in the United States, and it runs rampant. I mean, we've had, even in the UK, we've had people, apply for positions that have utilized these kinds of tropes around black men. And when asked to justify them, people just say, oh, that's just a debate. It's not a debate when you're utilizing racist stereotypes to talk about a people and then say that that gets a default position. So, I mean, if you're looking at contemporary people who advocate this view of black males, you're thinking about the conscious leads, you're thinking about the FD signifiers, you're thinking about, even Jared Ball, kind of sidelining the fact that black men and boys are victims of child sexual, child physical abuse, or black men are victims of intimate partner violence. These pundits have to eliminate all the data that we've known for the last 40 or 50 years to kind of create this mythology of black men as being toxic and problematic. We don't see antecedents of violence influencing how black men are constructed, socialized, traumatized into having negative social interactions or negative, intimate relationships with women. So we see black boys, we may say, well, what if that black boy is being abused by his mother? Because we have tremendous rates of child maltreatment in the black community, much of which happens at the hands of black women. Some of it happens in the hands of black men, but black boys in general have tremendous exposure to personal violence and abuse, during their early years. And we don't ask the fundamental question, well, how does that then affect how they see relationships, personal relationships, loving relationships with future partners? We've never asked how the environment that black men and boys come from influences them over their life course into adulthood or into their teenager years. And we like to blame them for that. So these pundits like to concentrate on that. They like to say, hey, look at the numbers that say that black men disproportionately abuse black women. And then that's when the experts come in, like epidemiologists, public health scholars, social workers say, wait, well, this idea of patriarchy that you're working with, that men are abusing women for patriarchy, that doesn't fit the cultural context of black people. Because black men aren't just abusers, they're also abused. Black men are not just dominating the home, because the black home was not constructed as an entity of male domination like it was for the white race. So then how do you just translate this idea of male domination in the home among white people to mean the same thing as male domination in the home for black people? See, there's a cultural gap there. But these pundits don't have to attend to any of the culturally relevant and culturally specific antecedents of black violence within our communities or within our homes. They just repeat the dominant idea that they know flies with pretty much white liberal thinking, which is patriarchy, sexism, and misogyny. So by not listening to the experts, what we have is this deliberate misrepresentation on social media that fits a very specific, politic. I mean, the people making these commentaries are self-avowed black feminists and liberals. They believe that black men should be chastised anytime they don't fall in line with liberal thinking. God forbid black men say the Democratic Party or liberal party platform doesn't benefit them. Somehow they want to be right-wing conservatives. Um, there's all kinds of things that black men are held accountable for that flies within popular media and the popular imagination that really just can't be shown within the research. If we were going on a strictly research basis, right? So we're looking at black male attitudes, we would find that black men are extremely progressive on issues of childcare, gender equality, economic inequality. They're very akin to women's issues on abortion. They're very sensitive to linked faith, or the close relationship that black men and women's political, heritage and legacies have to each other, that we benefit and lift each other up. That's what the research shows. But if you go off social media, you would think that every black man's a rapist, compensating for his inability to be a white man, and ultimately violent from the womb. And it's this difference, right? It's this difference in how we speak about black men, or what our starting point in speaking about black men really are. I think most recently this was kind of shown with the New York Times release of Howard University, where they said only 19% of black men were on campus at an HBCU. For anybody that studies black men, this isn't surprising whatsoever. But what ended up happening was you had this kind of condemnation of black men. So anytime there's a disparity where black men are doing worse than another group, it doesn't become because of some kind of institutional racism or discrimination, some barriers that are preventing black men from succeed or from success. No, there's something wrong with the mind culture of black men. So they don't believe they could, or as Tory said, black men don't believe they could succeed in college. That's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, right? Black men have fought historically to be in college. They fought for higher education. The issue is the barriers. The issue is whether or not, because of high levels of discrimination, and this is what Chetty's study showed a couple years ago, even black men with college degrees that work hard, that are born into the middle class, end up falling to the lower classes, right? Why? Because the high rates of job discrimination, what we call in black male studies, the anti-black misandry, the negative conceptualizations of black men, even when they're educated, to be associated with criminality, or to be even treated as if they have a criminal record, decreases the ability of them to earn the same thing that their white male or white female counterparts earn in those contexts.
That
So these pundits don't attend to that specificity. They just attend to, well, this is my view of black men. This is the view that gets me likes. So we'll say all black men are deficit, deviant, and ultimately can be despised.
you brought up a great point, right? So people fail to acknowledge the fact that they themselves or the institution
Mhm.
acts in a manner of society. They feel like they're for whatever reason when you go to a job, the job doesn't have the same perspective as black people as society, and black men aren't
Yeah,
impacted by
yeah.
that perspective, and they don't want to acknowledge the perspective they have, how it's been internalized, and how it impacts their view, also their behavior and that
Hmm.
interaction with that person. So I think there's the denial about the biases people have towards black men and how it impacts their behavior and
No,
the
there
decision.
absolutely is. Yeah. I mean, and this, again, this is what I think is part of kind of the liberal mythology is that you've, look, the liberal feminist ideology says that to be male is to be privileged. But that's not what the data shows. That's not what any study shows. Most studies in Western society show that being male associates the target male group. So if you're a Palestinian man or a Muslim man or a black man, with danger. This is why black male study scholars speak so adamantly about misandric aggression. Is that we have popular conceptualizations of how gender operates, but it's not backed up by any of the social or social psychological studies or data. Right? When you look at a man, you see that man as a possible encapsulation of every negative thing of an alien race. So if I see a black man, I see savagery, I see criminality, I see harm. So what we're expected to believe by these, social media pundits, if you will, is that the popular discussion or concept of patriarchy that says that all men are privileged, right? When black men suffer some of the most egregious disadvantages within the society, incarceration, premature death during COVID, suffered the most mortality but wasn't recognized for it, employment discrimination, educational discrimination, undereducated, etc. When you look at all these different issues, and you say, well, that's still privilege because they're a man. Well, is that how they're treated? So black men report having some of the highest rates of both direct discrimination, like active discrimination, as well as passive discrimination with on jobs or just in society, being treated differently than everyone else. But those studies, that all the work we get from actually investigating reality in the world, don't seem to matter much because we have this guiding ideology, right, that tells us no, you're privileged. Well, the effect of that is you don't think that men suffer by being men. You think that the stereotypes that cause black men to be shot walking across the street, that cause black men to be disregarded whenever they're sexually assaulted. Black boys have some of the highest rates of child sexual assault in the United States of any other group, but because they're men, they can't be sexually vulnerable. These kinds of feminist and liberal ideations of black maleness prevent us from understanding the vulnerability of the group. So there's no reason for people to think that black men suffer on the basis of maleness, not because it's not true, but because that's what everyone says. And what I think is one of the most deplorable aspects of these kinds of social media pundits is that they want to preserve viewership, right? And this is what I find to be greatly disingenuous about it. To preserve viewership, they will tell people that black boys are black men who suffer domestic abuse, or black boys who are survivors of child physical and child sexual abuse. Their stories don't matter because what's more important is focusing on the idea, and it's just the idea that violence is completely male directed from some kind of deviant or want to be powerful over women. You see, when the Duluth model was created, that's the name of the model. Michael Pyamar and Ellen Pitts created this idea that patriarchy causes domestic violence, that men beat women for power within the household. They only looked, well, I think there were a few Asians, but it was a predominantly view of white people. They didn't ask black people, they didn't study black people about why violence breaks out in their communities. Right before the 1980s, the view about domestic violence was that black people, men and women, killed each other because they were culturally incapable of having strong nuclear families the ways that white people did. You see, before you got a
Hold on
feminist
real quick.
interpretation.
That was in academic studies.
Yeah, that was academic studies. So I mean,
That's
you could look
wild.
at like if you look at Wolfgang and Ferracuti's book on the subculture of violence theory, they studied Philadelphia. And they were asking, well, why is it that black women seem to kill more black men, have a higher homicide rate against black men, right, than other races of people? And their explanation was, well, black men aren't very good patriarchs. Black homes are matriarchal. So the black woman having to take on the head of household role tend to shoot and kill these black men in their homes to discipline them because black men are not like white men. They don't know how to keep a nuclear family intact. See, everything, this is what I say is that all the theories that we use to explain black reality come from deficit models. Because you're not like white people, something is wrong with your family, something's wrong with your consciousness, something's wrong with the way you behave in civil society. So you've taken this kind of drudgery of black pathology and you just picked one out, patriarchy, to explain black people. But black people, I mean, even back in the 1930s, you had them saying that, well, because black people are savages and don't respect the union of marriage, black men and women aren't very faithful to one another. And the effect of them not being faithful to one another is that you have black women that kill black men because of infidelity, right? And this is in the 1930s. So they said this was part of the segregationist psychology of black Americans. You can pick any time period and you'll find the same phenomena. What we know when we look at science is that people who are segregated within poor neighborhoods, people who are segregated within violent neighborhoods, will also have higher rates of violence within their households. That's across the board for men, women, children, etc. Children will fight children. Children will be misbehaved. Children will lash out. There are studies in urban black communities where black boys who are dating black girls in junior high have more experiences and reports of physical violence during dating. So there's dating abuse there as well. These pundits are so dishonest because they're trying to push a certain ideology for viewership. The reality of the situation is if you don't take up some kind of intersectional or black feminist view of violence in the black community, you won't get to the top of the algorithm in YouTube. So you see this with the signifiers, you see this with the conscious leads, you see this with the Jared Balls. I was watching at one point. I watched this show, and one of the guests, I'm not familiar with the gentleman, but he made this comment. He said, "Look, because there are not shelters for black men, that suggests that the problem of male violence in the black community is not that significant." Suggesting that because there were shelters for women, we all knew this was a major societal problem. Now, let me talk. I just want to say a moment. Just think about the ignorance of this. We live in white supremacist societies where white people determine the issues, the institutions, and the kinds of investments that are put into social problems. Now, there's no major institutions for racism. It's not like the United States and different municipalities have said racism is a major social problem. Let's create centers for the trauma of racism or shelters for people who are victims of racism. Could we then conclude that there's no racism in the society? Right? We don't see many shelters for disabled people. People are still pushing for visibility of domestic abuse against the disabled and the elderly. Should we thereby conclude that there's no abuse against elder population or disabled populations? Of course not. But when it comes to black men, such kinds of pronouncements and proclamations are considered serious analysis because they perpetuate the political leanings of the time. Namely, that women are abused, that they're not abusers, despite the fact that we have 40 or 50 years of data saying otherwise, that black men are only abusing for power and to compensate for what they lack, and that violence in the black community can be almost totally explained by the deviance of black men and boys. All three of those things are untrue when we look at the data. All three of those things are untrue when I talk to people, black men and boys who have been victimized by child physical, sexual abuse, etc. Pundits are
And
not interested in expertise; they're interested in viewership, and it's a shame because people take these people as being serious. Yes.
how has the often overlooked abuse of black males, physical, mental, and sexual, contributed to the hyper-sexualization of black men and challenges in building healthy relationships?
Oh, well, I mean that's our lecture itself. Well, let me say briefly the first problem is the disregard, right? So When we look at the child physical and sexual abuse literature, we see that victims of abuse tend to either lash out, become abusers themselves, or develop dependency relationships with other people who continue cycles of abuse. Okay. Within the Black community, we have high levels of exposure to violence, not because of our culture or because we're Black people, but because we're in environments and neighborhoods that are impoverished, that are violent, that are neglected, etc. So there are structural factors, right, living in a racist society that put Black people in contact with violence. Now, that being said, that violence that's in neighborhoods and in communities bleeds into the household, and these Black boys are going to experience that. When you have a Black boy that's physically abused, when you have a Black boy that can no longer trust the sanctity and sacredness of the home or the parents, that creates distrust. It creates a kind of skepticism, if not pessimism, about the ways that the world is going to treat this young man. And they internalize that. And when I say internalize, I don't mean they become bad people, but they take note of that and it develops as part of their consciousness. We also see this as being related to suicide ideation and depression in young Black men as well. So we find that these hostile environments where the young Black boy doesn't feel safe, that he's always a victim of stress. And
Can you elaborate more on that concept of battle fatigue? Because many brothers who
yeah,
grew up
racial
in
battle.
the city
Mhm.
know about it. It's nonstop stress, it's nonstop navigating, it's nonstop looking around and being strategic with stuff. So can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah. This is, William A. Smith, a great friend of mine, colleague, developed the concept of racial battle fatigue to talk about the way that allostatic load and stress impacts the psychological and physiological aspects of Black men regulating themselves. Right, that they're not on balance because they're constantly watching over their shoulder. They're on high alert. Right, there's a constant worry about where the next threat or attack's coming, and this leads to various real comorbidities, right? High blood pressure, diabetes, lack of sleep, unrestfulness, anxiety, depression. And we have to kind of take note about the way the environment's actually impacting Black men physiologically and psychologically, how our minds are never at rest, how we're never feeling safe, how we don't have security. This becomes a major part of how we start thinking about Black men's mental health uh, and their life chances. So what ends up happening is Black men experience this. Black boys experience this. They experience it in school. They experience it when they see cops. They experience it within home, right? And all of this is activated within a context of abuse, with a context of neglect, a context where people say that Black men and boys don't have real problems, that they're failures naturally. So what we're seeing, just like in the Howard situation with the New York Times, what we're seeing is not them being victims of institutional discrimination. What we're seeing is the manifestation of their inadequacies. Imagine how stressful something like that would be to a young man that or someone who's trying to go to college or someone who's in college, maybe a Black man who's a student at Howard. You see, what narrative did the nation, did Black people, did Black pundits give to better understand what this young man is going through, besides the narrative of his failure? See, all of these things work in conjunction to negate the humanity and existence of Black men and boys. So when we don't recognize child sexual and child physical abuse in our communities, it's not us having this kind of battle of recognition as many pundits are trying to make it. It's about how the suffering that no one recognizes is allowed to continue because we won't preserve the safety and humanity of a Black man or a Black boy. Right? Like imagine if someone was able to beat you every day, that you had, say, your mother or caretakers, your mother's friends, able to have sex with you at 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, because that's the age group of these young men that are now telling us about this in their 30s and 40s. You see, when and that's what I mean. There's a certain humbleness that comes from talking to victims. That's not interested in battles of recognition. That's interested in how did we miss the humanity of this group of people? How did this young boy not be treated as a child? Why did we not show him care? Does the society hate him? Does the people in his community hate him so much that no one said it's not right to do this to him? It's not right to beat him. It's not right to rape him. We had one story of a young man whose mother's friend used to pay him to have oral sex with her. Right? Was who intervenes and says that's wrong? Right? As a society, we'll sit back and look at something like an R. Kelly and talk about the danger he has, right? The danger he poses to black women in his community. And him and his brother were victimized, I believe, by their cousin or sister for almost a decade, right? Made to do sexual things. Not a single person intervenes and says, well, what happened to that humanity that was lost? You see, this is the danger. The danger is to say, well, look, the nature of black men is sexually deviant, so we don't have to worry about what caused it. That's just how they are. So if his older sister or his older cousin wants to use him as a sexual plaything, him and his brother, that doesn't cause any harm because that's who he is. You see, the view of black boys as being hypersexual is what allows us to disregard so heavily their humanity. And when we see these black boys who end up in bad relationships, who are depressed, who are disengaged, right, who are triggered, right, by this kind of trauma they've experienced, we say, look, there's that black man. We knew he was a criminal. We knew he was hypersexual. We knew he hated women. We knew he was a danger. The stereotypes form the basis of the logic we use to interpret black male suffering, rather than looking at black male suffering and saying, look at what the suffering is doing to take away from the humanity, the patience, and the peace that these young black men need to navigate a hostile racial world.
Unfortunately, right? It's like I call it the elephant in the room, sexual abuse. Based on the research you have done, right? What are the numbers of sexual abuse in the black community, or are there any statistics that accurately reflect closely what the numbers are?
Mm-hmm. So I'll start with the latter question. So I wrote a literature review on child sexual assault for an anthology, and we don't have accurate numbers per se because child sexual abuse cases are not part of like the CDC survey data. The CDC survey data starts at age 18 up. So most child sexual abuse happens before the age of 18, before people are adults. But we do have estimates based on specific studies in our communities that show that, say, between the ages of 9 and 14, black boys are most likely to have an early sexual debut. So in terms of statutory rape, we know that black boys tend to report having higher incidences of statutory rape compared to every other racial and sex group in the United States, being between blacks, whites, and Asians, right? That doesn't tell us an exact number, but it does give us an estimate of how many young black boys are being exposed to sex at a very, very early age, and how that exposure, because most report having that exposure due to the actions of older women, how that's not being understood, and it's certainly not being treated or studied within the United States or other academic disciplines. As to the first question, it's a little complicated because for victims of child sexual abuse or child physical abuse, we do see higher incidences of sexual promiscuity and sexual risk taking. So, say sex with a high number of partners without condom use. I don't know if it's correlated specifically with if they're abused by a man or a woman. We've had some, and I think in our snapshot, we had one or two men who were victimized by other men, but they reported the same kind of sexual histories that we got with men who were abused by women. So I think it's really a question of, and there could be some difference. We just don't have a large enough sample. We just haven't studied, enough survivors yet. But if you're abused sexually, it tends to psychologically prone you to either disregard for the abuser, be it man or woman, and higher sexual risk taking and promiscuity. So both of those things happen, and there's a higher chance of having a child before the age of 21 if you've been a victim of child sexual abuse. So I always hesitate with the compensation thing because I don't I don't know if trauma necessarily should be seen as or acting out on trauma as a compensatory thing, right? If a person was abused and they're searching for love, if a person was abused and they're coping with that constant loss or their inability to consent, so they appreciate multiple consensual relations, right? Who knows what that individual's searching for, right? And what we tend to do with black boys is we'll say, oh, well, if you were abused, oh, well, it doesn't matter, you're broken, and then you're harming everyone else. We seem to want to relate anything that black men do for their psychological comfort as a threat to others. And what my research is really trying to push is like, well, listen, we see black men and boys reacted in very similar ways that other groups reacted. So if you did a study on, I mean, most of the literature is on white people. So if you do a study on white women or black or white boys, white women or girls or black white men and boys, you find that they've done the same thing. They have higher rates of acting out, higher rates of getting suspended from school, higher risk of having a child before the age of 12. It's the same thing. So I don't understand why with the black man or boy it becomes this issue of compensation with white people. It becomes, well, look, this is trauma responsive. This is coping. This is them trying to make the best out of a bad situation. And we see this language around white women all the time, right? If a white woman is abused, there's an outpouring of sympathy for what may be a high number of sexual partners, a high risky sexual behavior on the basis of trauma. Well, with a black boy, you can have him abused, raped, damn near killed, and it's still, well, that's just how black men are. That's the difference, right? The difference is one person says there are sociological or epidemiological reasons for certain behaviors. There's a social context, a history that we have to examine to understand what's making this individual do something. With a black man, it says, well, we don't need a history. That's just how black men are. And that's the difference that I say in my work between the sociological and ontological. Black men are made to be ontological remnants of a perilous existence. They're just what's left over after all the other humanity's been taken up, where everyone else has a humanity. So when someone acts violently or someone acts not lovingly towards another person, it's because something was taken away from them. And what we've done with black men and boys is we've really leaned into this idea that they're broken because it's elevated certain members of the black community. It's elevated certain leaders. The people who make this argument about black men and boys, regardless of their political stance, is usually appreciated and rewarded within the academy. And mind you, this is for numbers. Like we talk about numbers, right? This is for people like the rate of black men's abuse of women, right? Talking about over the age of 18. It's not very different than black women's victimization or abuse of men, right? The rates of they don't measure perpetrators, they measure victimization. So black men are reporting being just as abused as black women are, right? When you're looking at other communities, like white communities or sexual minority communities, they're reporting higher levels of victimization, right? So if you're bisexual or if you're queer or lesbian, right, you have higher rates of victimization. Not because you're gay, but because you're in degraded, marginalized environments and communities. The same communities that you find other people, marginalized people like black people in, right? But there's no explanation. People are not saying, hey, because you're gay, because you're homosexual or queer, queer, whatever your term may be, you're committing violence because you're fundamentally broken. So you could have a higher rate of victimization in that community. And nobody says the people in those communities are fundamentally more violent and broken. Oh, but look, you take the same liberal ideology, the same feminist politics, and you look at the numbers of black men and they're lower than those communities. Are they equal to that of their women? Are they higher in victimization? They report more victimization of domestic abuse and child sexual abuse and early statutory rape, et cetera, than white communities. Their victimization is never concentrated on. They're broken. They're more violent. You see, that's what I mean about the disregard. Because, you have to understand, when I give these presentations, it's almost laughable because, the CDC puts these things in charts, right? And the charts for men and women are right next to each other. So you can literally say 4.3 is the rates for black women, 4.4 is the rates for black men. You can compare that to some of the other data sets on sexual minorities. And nobody ever, and I've presented on domestic abuse and had to be at least a dozen times, if not more. And nobody's ever attended. No, not one person has said, "Wow, that's unbelievable that we've missed that many men suffer." The attention is always in, well, look at how many black women suffer. Your conversation pointing out black men means that you're negating this. I was like, no, I'm just showing them side by side. I'm trying to say that this is a problem within our communities. And every single time without fail, the overwhelming focus of this work is to say, of the response in the audience is to say, well, here are the excuses or here are the reasons I think that women or sexual minorities have high rates. And I was like, but we're not arguing about their rates. The rates are given. I'm interested in why these numbers look like these numbers. We just can't conceptually get it, right? So what ends up happening is that black men are pushed out of conversations as victims. Black boys are pushed out of conversations as victims. And because of that, there's no study of these populations as victims of violence at the hands of other men or women. And the only time you really get concession, both amongst the academy and pundits, is if you say men are abusing other men. You see, so the female perpetrator is taken out of the equation altogether. Sometimes I look at these conversations on Twitter, and I look at how conversations happen in the academy, and all the onus becomes, well, these black men didn't tell anybody. And I'm confused, brother. I'm so confused. We don't believe that in a white supremacist patriarchal society that women telling about their experience is going to necessarily bring justice. We believe that, right, that in patriarchal racist societies, these groups are marginalized, so the violence against them are not taken seriously. But then somehow when black men say, well, look, people don't listen to us, right? Nobody acknowledges our pain and suffering, they're then blamed. Well, you're too silent about it. As if them saying, hey, these women, these men, these people are raping us and abusing us, making us penetrate them before our age of consent, that somehow that means that our just society is going to remedy it, right? And that's why I say that it's always a contradiction. If you do not believe speaking up, or you believe that racism and sexism and patriarchy make certain kinds of violence as normal, why do you then put the responsibility on these marginalized and these children to speak up about their abuse against a whole system, culture, and environment that tells them that men can't be raped, especially black men, and
Facts.
then blame them for the problem not being solved instead of the people that are harming them, which are often older women, their caretakers, or men in their community. You see, that's what disgusts me. See, and this is what I meant earlier when I talk about the misrepresentation of our problems. It disgusts me because we don't study black people as if they're entities that can be improved, that can have their conditions ameliorated, or who would fundamentally change if their circumstances change.
It's just
We
a
speak about black men as if they were fundamentally born as the scourges of the earth, that they're fundamentally deviant, and even if they were educated, even if they were given the same opportunities as other groups, right, for freedom, that they would squander it. And this is the pathological view. This is the misandric view that we have of black men and boys, not just across liberal arts, not just across social media, but at the core of how we engage the population. Nobody's protected from these biases. And then when you show that these biases have no basis in data, brother, the situation on this issue, when we're talking about domestic violence and abuse, the data is 40, 50 years thick on this.
yeah.
Right? Like in 1976, when they did the first National Family Violence Study, they found that black men were disproportionately killed compared to every other group. So the highest rates, besides for white women, the highest rates of interpartner homicide were against black men in their community. Now that's from 76 to 92, 93. Nobody wants to touch that. Nobody wants to cover that.
I would just want to clarify for those listening and
Yeah,
clarify. So you're saying that black men are killed by their partner more than black women are killed by their partner based on the data.
in 1976 to 1992, yes.
Yeah.
Those numbers have changed because now the numbers of intimate partner homicides generally have gone down per year, right? So now you would have, I mean, I think the last supplement on violence against women report was like 290. I want to say 291, right? Intimate partner homicides could be 300.
Yeah.
I may be misremembering. For black men, you have to, they don't publish men's killed who are victims of intimate partner homicide, but you go to a supplemented UCR report, I think that number was like 150, 140, 150, right? So it depends, right? It depends per year. It depends on what you're controlling for, right? The violence against women report utilizes a formula where if a person's killed, and actually note this in the UCR data, if a black man kills, say, his girlfriend and her three other friends, say he decides to rob them, right? Those three other friends are counted as part of the intimate partner homicide.
I see. I got you.
Right. So even though he's only killing his girlfriend, there are three other witnesses, so those people are all counted.
To maintain that.
So it maintains a bigger number, and the UCR even denotes that. It actually has this star where it says how it understands that. So those numbers are not completely accurate, but the point is that it gives us, and no numbers are completely accurate, but it gives us a picture of what's happening in our communities. What we get from the academy and from pundits is that black men are slaughtering black women in our communities. Yeah. That there are 14 million black people, there's 7 million, like 7.5 million black adults, and they're at constant war with each other. These black men are just murdering these. That's not true, right? That's what I mean. This is why I say that the overarching ideology of black people is fundamentally violent destroys our ability to actually look at the black population with any kind of nuance and care, right? We don't need to dismiss violence against women no more than we need to dismiss violence against men, but we should study violence instead of just making claims that black people are violent. And that's fundamentally different. So when you're trying to decrease violence in white neighborhoods, you're analyzing things like, well, what's the rate of child abuse within homes? Are boys who are abused by mothers or fathers producing young men who are abusers? Is high rates of alcoholism producing abusers in white communities? They get tons and tons of money to study this stuff. When it's black people, it's a question about patriarchy, it's a question about identity. It's never a question of politics. It's never a question of economics. It's certainly not a question of neighborhood segregation or economics.
What role does the lack of capital and equitable access to loans play in limiting the sustainability of black owned businesses?
That'll be a tremendous role, right? I mean, when you look at many of the programs that are set up for women, for example, there's an acknowledgement of a need of startup capital to fuel entrepreneurship. That seems to be widely recognized. We look at household wealth, the amount of money that white households hold in relationship to black households. We see that there's a tremendous disparity there. Sandy Darity's work and Derek Houns's work is tremendous on this. So that deficit means that you're not going to get the kinds of startups among black men that I think you can see in other groups. And it also means the longevity and the investment of that's going to take a toll, right? So you're not going to get businesses that are able to sustain themselves and, with marketing, get a good a consumer base, and just have constant institutional support in the long run. So I mean, it makes a huge difference. I think that's given. Low interest rate loans are important both for black home ownership with dealing with mortgages and for starting businesses. And black people, especially black men, have not been beneficiaries of that historically. So yeah, I mean, I think that's just kind of a statement of fact. It matters, it's important, and it explains both the demise and the lack of longevity among these kinds of businesses in our communities.
I've heard you speak numerous times about black political power, right?
Oh
Remaining
yes.
limited even with support from white liberals. Can you
Mhm.
explain why that support hasn't translated into empowerment and what the real empowerment would look like?
I mean, brother, this is one of those questions that are always people's opinions, but let me at least provide some context and justification for my view of this. One of the things that I've been immensely impressed by, and I guess stained or struck by, is the way that Carmichael and Hamilton in Black Power stated that coalitions with people that have more money and political power than you will never yield to your interests, and the Democratic Party in the United States will not be the panacea, so to speak, of Black liberation and Black problems, for Black liberation and for Black problems. And the reason I think that's so important is because you recognize that most of the political systems and ideologies we've been fed post civil rights have very little to do with black empowerment and everything to do with white dependency, our dependency on white people. Now, if you take the view of intersectionality in itself is geared towards the idea that there should no longer be a black messiah, and that black political power is best put in the hands of multiracial and multicultural coalitions on similar issues. Now, this is the same idea that white liberals pushed during the civil rights movement. It's a kind of view that at the end of his life, Martin Luther King became increasingly suspicious of, given the way that white liberal organizations and white liberals themselves were stalling black civil rights gains and civil rights efforts. It's something that was rejected by X early in his or towards the middle of his life. It is something that was certainly rejected by critical race theorists like Derek Bell, etc. Uh, the asymmetrical power relations between whites and blacks in the United States means that even if black people are working with whites, they're at best third parties, right? They're never going to be at the core of how interest, politics, policies, and initiatives are being undertaken because they don't have the money or they don't pose a political threat to whites in such a way that white people don't have to do anything differently than what they conceptualize. Now, most people support this view because they say, listen, black people we've been trained to understand that black people are meant to ask white people to become better. Practically every theory in the US Academy that deals with American race relations is integrationist and based on that codependence relationship. And I start my classes with this. I ask them, when you're taught about Black people, what are you taught? And they said, well, we're given things like epistemic injustice because we're trying to constantly make white people see Black people differently. I was like, but how do Black people see themselves? How do Black people have a positive vision of themselves and materialize that into reality? What philosophy teaches you that? And to that question, there's never an answer. We don't know any. So when you ask the same question among, say, the Black intellectual class or Black politicians, and say, look, Black people have a positive conceptualization of themselves as Americans who have resisted white supremacy, of Americans who have been against Western imperialism, how we of people who are truly about democracy in a world where whites can't seem to grasp the idea because they set up numerous systems and barriers to people's access to health care and clean water and food. How do we get to that? And no one has an answer because we've not developed Black political theories over the last 40 or 50 years based on Black people becoming empowered, controlling their own businesses, neighborhoods, and most importantly, the images and consciousness they have of themselves. We develop political theories on the basis that if we work better with white people, if we assimilate, if we're not threatening to them, that we can make advancements in our careers, that we have much more peaceful and enriched lives. And this is what I write about in my book. If we distance ourselves from those dirty Negroes that are suffering, being locked up, stopped by cops, etc., right? That is Black progress. We see Black political
Right.
progress as being separate from the people that are fundamentally suffering rather than being a part of that. So our political theories, right, haven't been geared towards us establishing empowerment the same way that we would say something like the feminist movement, where we talk about white women needing to be more CEOs, more politicians, more governors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. See, we teach those marginalized populations like white women, control your image, control your institutions, control what people say about you. And if they don't, they're punished. We teach Black people to be better pleaders, better beggars, bigger, better ways of asking and fitting in to white liberal theories and Black liberal institutions. That's our mistake. And now that Trump's in power, right? Where are our liberal friends? See, we can't talk. There's no white people we can form coalitions with now
Yeah.
because those coalitions are predicated on how white people are saying they experience fascism, not on how they experience racism. You see, when they were kicking Black people out of the academy, when they were threatening Black people's lives because they had opinions that didn't reflect well on America or its white supremacist heritage, that was just a Black problem. That was just Black scholars being attacked by the alt-right. Nobody worried about fascism 5, 7, 10 years ago, even though the exact thing was happening. Now Trump gets into office, and Trump is doing the same thing to white academics and people who support Palestine that you saw being done to Black people that supported Black revolution, Black freedom, Black safety against cops, the disregard of Black civil rights in a government that was being led or just come off the presidency of America's first Black president. And that was fine. Those are just racist people. It's not a problem. Well, that was a sign of things to come. Because what as always, you see then that the racism that Black people were experiencing as academics and politicians, where their lives were able to be threatened and their careers were able to be taken away for not holding a popular thought, if it offended liberals or it offended white conservatives. Now somehow that becomes the problem when in mass, this is how white people are experiencing Trump. You see, the problem is that Black politics then, and this is the proof of it, Black politics was never strong enough to protect its own people. And now that you have a certain groups of white liberals that are no longer in power, white liberals are having trouble protecting their own people, their own institutions, because the people that run these white liberal institutions are at their heart fundamentally conservative. So if Black politics is being taught to gain favor with white liberals who have the power to make changes in liberal institutions, get you a job, get you resources to certain grants, help you start businesses, etc. Well, when those white liberals are no longer in power, black politics suddenly loses all its force because black politics was geared towards impressing and speaking nice in front of white liberals and not being able to rule or have a stake in the infrastructure and capital production of a society that fundamentally doesn't believe that you should be equal, much less viewed as human. So what have we ran into with black politics? We've run into a dependency complex where white liberals no longer have power, and the white conservatives and right wings said we just don't love black folk that much to care about what you do. This is a white republic. This is going to become a white republic. And it's time that you know that. So black politics is a mere shadow of itself. It's going to lead to black people either trying to wrap their interest or ideas up in white liberal stances against fascism. And I think you see this now with the black academic class using fascism more and more to talk about what Trump is doing not outside of, but as wrapped up with issues of white supremacy and misogyny, et cetera. And you're going to see this kind of pitch where black people are going to try to become more advocates of a liberal ideology so they could beat back conservatism. And they're going to, at the end of it, they're going to say, well, this is a success for intersectional politics, when ultimately it's just going to be a success to get more white people, more white liberals back in power, and hope that they get benefits from supporting the people, the white regime that now gets to call itself president or dictate the institutions for the next few decades.
Listen to you talk, and I appreciate your explanation of black politics. Right? How would you define black culture? That's a big question now. A lot of people ask, like, what is black culture? And the way I observe it, there are two types. You have white-made black culture, and you have an idea of black culture, right? How would you define black culture, or is anyone able to define what black culture is in America?
Man, you ask me these difficult questions because I take your question seriously. Well, look, I mean, there's always going to be a view of black people that black people hold themselves as fundamentally different than the white society. So the white society has a view of black people that's always been inferior, savage, wanting for certain things, not equal to the standard of white humanity that's been established by their institutions, philosophies, renderings, etc. When I think we look at black culture, I don't know if we could say what it is because there's so many different variations of it, right? It has such variety. I did an interview back in the day where I said that, black culture contains the cosmos of all creation, resistance, and origins for our people. It's that archive, that cosmic archive, that I think any group of people, be it historical, ancestral, or even contemporary, used to invent itself. And I mean, I think that's the best we can do. It has nothing but possibilities, but is so vast that it extends beyond the nothingness. And I know that seems kind of poetic, but it means that the symbols, that the logics that we use to make sense of reality are all part of our culture. So in America specifically, we have a culture of resistance. So we receive resistance in our dress, our food, our style, our commentary, etc. We're constantly in a mark for our preservation. So we see different ways that we pivot to try to maintain that. Community and family have been historically very important to us. And I think that's why you see our communities now having an internal criticism of whether or not some of these gender battles, I think what they call it, the sex battle, it's not the battle of the sex, gender wars, that these gender wars are doing to black men and women actually pairing up, right? How have young generations looked at this differently? This is why, I mean, when I look at social commentary, I see this huge problematization by the black community of things like feminism and liberalism and all these other ideas. Black culture is a reflective element. And I think that we don't see black people as being animated by that resistance heritage or the kind of cultural reason, or what I call in my work, cultural logics, that other groups of people have. When we see something happen to white people, right, like if they're French or if they're Spanish, etc., we believe that there's something culturally distinct about that group of people because they govern themselves, they have their own nation, etc. When we look at black people, we see black culture in the things that are fleeting, our music, our dance, our clothes, etc., because we don't see those practices fundamentally linked to a land, a heritage, and a people because we're displaced. I think that harms us because it gives us the impression that everything we're doing is reactionary, that everything that we do is in conflict or resistance to something that's imposed on us. And that's not to say that there are things, it's certainly the case that some of that is that, but it's not the case that all of it is. Because when we ask that question, well, what are we reacting to? What's the material? What's the consciousness? What's in that reservoir that's going to grasp onto that materiality and change it? What made us play the guitar the way we play? What makes us play the trumpet or trombone the way we play? What makes us cook the way we, right? There are artifacts here, there are remnants here that we have that have been largely positive. But we're framed, and this is the thing that upsets me. Black culture is not framed by how Black people live it out and experience it. Black culture is framed by how the dominant group who controls the media, who controls the education opportunities, who controls what Black scholars are taught so they can exist within academia. They're that group of people tell us what Black culture is, and then
That,
we have Black people repeat,
and I
right?
just
So that's one of the things that I think makes Black culture so hard to identify, and
and,
something for us to not be able to adequately study.
and you brought up a great point, and I think the general public's not aware of this. The attack on academia, academics, people in academics are so limited to what they can research because there are two issues with that. One is the funding, and two is the sustainability of their career.
Mhm.
You're penalized by delving in deeper topics, particularly within Black
Absolutely,
culture. So, like,
absolutely.
how has that hurt us collectively as a people when our bright scholars can't do research in the areas that we need to shed light on certain things and
Mhm.
also help us develop?
Oh well, I mean, you have to think that practically every branch of contemporary society has at some point been an idea that some theorist has had about how society works. Like white society didn't just wake up and say, "Oh, we're on the brink of a technological revolution," or "We founded the internet." And look, these are all products of how certain theorists thought about the connectivity or the possibility of technology or of capital resources or of even democracy. And what you have in the academy, and this is of course a generalization, right? So it doesn't mean that each and every single person operates in this way, but it does mean that there are currents, right? And I think this is well reflected within the Black studies literature. This is why I respect people like Asante, so much, is that um, there is a difference between Black people who have assimilated the worldview of white liberals as the basis of interpreting Black problems, and then Black people who have charted a different course, so to speak, about how we should study Black people, be it from an African centered perspective or a culturally relevant perspective or a sociological perspective, like someone like a W.E.B. Du Bois, who people write about all the time now, but don't really respect in terms of what he was actually saying or the why behind why we need to study Black folk as separate than the kind of histories and sociologies told about us in white social science. Even when a mentor and personal hero of mine, Derek Bell, even when Bell was writing what he wrote about white supremacy and about the interest that Black people had in desegregation, it differed fundamentally from what white people saw, right? Like Black people wanted good schools. Black people wanted safe neighborhoods. They wanted to enjoy a world where they felt as if they can actually be it citizen, be it Black, etc. White people don't understand that because that's not how they engage with Black people. So if you then say, well, here are white ideas, like what we were talking about with domestic violence, or even what we think is the aspirations of the human. And if you say, well, look, human beings have always been interested in war, conflict, domination of one another. Well, is that the same view that Black people had? I'm not saying that it's not. It could very well be the case that when we do kind of a survey of all Black people throughout history, that they're just as war porn. But we've never done that. So can we make that conclusion? You see, the study of Black people means creating the nuance. Black people could be that existential qualifier, which just basically means that they're an example of some human beings that don't operate in that way. But we start with the assumption that we could read Black people, write Black people, interpret Black people as part of the same issues that white societies have. So we'll say, well, Black people have the same kind of narcissistic complex that Freud said all people have. Well, why would I believe that? Why would I believe that someone who's studying people in Europe somehow dictates how black people from Africa and the United States or the Southern in Southern segregation have the same? Why would I make that assumption? Right. But we're so quickly drawn to how white people have developed theory that we utilize that to describe black people. Black studies was meant to interrupt that. So when we look at the Robert Staples, the Nathan Harris, the Du Bois, the Drakes, etc., the assumption, the E. Franklin Frazier is a great cat, right? The assumption is that you have to look into black historical material, black narrative, black history, black reality, black economics, all these different things to understand how black people think about the world so that we do not make the mistake of presuming that black people are just white people with darker skin, that there's something fundamentally different about the human anthropology, the philosophical core and origin of black people that's been picked up either through history or God knows if you're religious, put there by God. That means that they have a different view of how they want to create structures and hierarchies within a society. For us to simply say that, well, black people would do the same thing as white people is not only a postulate, it's just unproven hypothesis, but it's something that we have lots of historical evidence to say that is not the case, right? So what black studies should be doing, right, is creating that nuance. But that's a lot of work, and it makes you extremely unpopular, right? And that's why I say that as a scholar, I could disagree with some of the things that Asante may say, even though I'm a huge fan of his work. But you have to respect it. You have to respect somebody that says, "Here's a different worldview." Right? Same thing with Bell. I could disagree with something Bell says as a scholar, but you have to respect the view that he said, "Well, wow, here you have a view that said that segregation was the basis of black people's oppression when there's really white supremacy." So are we conceptualizing black people as having their own interest in their political futures, or are we only enforcing the will that white liberals have about where they're willing to place black people? You see, these are very important paradigmatic conversations that we still haven't answered as black scholars, because you have a lot of black scholars taking up the view that white liberals held in the 1960s and 70s. So when you ask the question, well, then what do black people want? Well, we have this view of bourgeois middle class black women as being a revolutionary vanguard, where middle class educated black men want to be white people or white men, where poor black people are compensating because of what they don't have. I mean, it's the whole pool, the ideas, right, that black people hold about their own people is reflective of the psychosis and pathology that white people believe black people had in the first place. That's not liberatory, and it's not scholarship, and it certainly doesn't lend itself to any kind of liberation movement, be it epistemic or political. So we have to reassess, right, the role the black academic plays within predominantly white institutions now that we've had a reformulation of what America's higher ed landscape looks like. That means that while you will have black people that are still rewarded for saying tremendously negative things about other black people, we have to start questioning whether or not that actually reflects the reality of black people as a whole. Or we could start asking, what does this tell us about the investment and enterprise of the black academic in relationship to the black community and black people? And that's not something that a lot of black academics encourage, because black academics really, as a mass, as a whole, don't interact with working class black people, much less poor black people, to share their research. Black people become more objects or entities of study and theorization rather than people that we learn from, interact with, etc.
There was an article you co-wrote called "Parental Educational Attainment." The question I have is, a lot of times people always tell you read with your kids, do this with your children,
Yeah.
and they present it as if it's an absolute for outcome, right?
Hmm.
But in that article, you speak about how even though a parent has a certain educational level or
Hmm.
educational attainment, I believe that's the term you use, and they're working with the child, that socioeconomic status and that environment can trump the child's ability to learn
Yes.
and
Yes.
retain
Yeah.
information. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Mhm. Yeah, that's some of the work that I did with Shervin Asari, great public health scholar. You know, Basically the argument is very straightforward, that we've tend to think that any kind of educational or academic underattainment on behalf of black people, especially black boys, is due to the lack of motivation both from the student and from parental involvement. And what we found is that, well, look, when you start looking at racism, poverty, right? Because poverty runs across the board in terms of all races and ethnicities. You see an effect on educational attainment and memory. And this becomes important because this is what I meant when I said that research is important because it tells us the differences that certain communities experience and challenges some of the universal assumptions we make. Universal assumptions that if you had a motivated child and a motivated parent, that child would succeed in school. But that presumes a few things. One, that the society is equal. Two, that the education system's equal. Three, that that the educator, which is usually a white woman in America, of primary age children in high school, is equal and unbiased, and that the child has no other effects out that could diminish the outcomes of a positive motivation and positive parental involvement. What we found is that, well, the environment matters, right? Stress matters, poverty matters, and racism matters. Not only in terms of the motivation the student has within a specific context, but in terms of how they develop their memory capacities and the way they perceive, retain information. Now, there have been other studies since the one that he was the first author that wrote that found similar things based on class. So, what it's really trying to show is that social, economic, and kind of historical environment, right, has an effect on both the development of children academically and intellectually, but also how they respond to different stressors, which may act against positive parental involvement and motivation. So, yeah, I think that it's I think we're still finding out just how far racism and the negation of Black people's humanity goes, right? It's that kind of research that's showing us that racism is not this just an idea of discrimination. And I think one of the worst things that happened out of the civil rights movement was this view that said racism was just like other forms of marginalization, because it's not, right? I mean, racism causes whole groups of people to disappear from the face of the earth. That's not the same thing as being feeling marginalized or not being recognized. It's eliminating the historical, physical, geographical presence of whole entities of people. And that's what racism does. It's funny because, when you look at someone like even Martin Luther King in his last book, he's like, look, racism is dehumanization. It's this ability, it's this idea that people don't have the right to exist. When you read someone like Derek Bell, he says, look, racism in America is this idea that we didn't have the right or ability, that we should not exist. And you have this said over and over and over again, but that's never the definitions of racism that we seem to focus on. So when we find studies like the one that Asari and I co-author with others, you say, well, look, I don't understand this. Well, look, if you have an environment where everything negates you, if you have an environment where you're deprived of attention, of social interaction, of resources, of if you're malnourished, if you have lack of food access, right? Like all these things combine to produce a body politic, a population, a demographic that will suffer in relationship to the dominant group. So when you have white people, sure, there's poor white people, but as a whole, white people hold the political power, the economic power, the corporate power, the neighborhood and municipal power, et cetera, to govern everybody else. Sure, they're going to be marginalized people within that, but the group compared to the group of Black people far, far outperform in terms of wealth, politics, and just brute power and number, right? So then do you really think that America itself, who's shown a history of lynchings, of murders, a history, a legacy of enslavement, colonization, a contemporary movement that's diminishing any diversity, that's putting back Confederate monuments? Do you really think that that's a place where Black people as a group are going to be allowed to hold the same kind of power as the group that dominates and rules over them? See, this is what I mean when I say we lack the seriousness about what we study. This is not an opinion. It's not an opinion that racism operates in this way. It's a debate as to whether people want to acknowledge that racism operates in this way. Because when you look at the history of any other colonized or conquered people, this is exactly what's happened. When you look at what the Brits did throughout Africa, or the Brits did throughout the Caribbean, or what's happening in South Africa right now, that the United States is a part of, that has no business being a part of, right? All of these are questions of domination and rule. But then when we get to America, somehow we think we're exceptional Negroes. that somehow the question of rule and domination don't apply to us, that we're just fighting and struggling to be equal to the people who have given us a chance to taking off our chains. And now you have an administration that says, well, look, that's not the case. So, yes, when you're starting to look at how racism operates, it's going to decrease life chances. It's going to increase comorbidities. It's going to increase mortalities. It's going to decrease the ability of people to have the same participation in classrooms. It's going to decrease the ability of people to be just as well. That means that racism makes Black people sicker, not only in terms of what they suffer throughout lifetime, but their underlying conditions, which make them susceptible to things like COVID-19 or maternal mortalities or prostate cancer, et cetera. Racism is a societal engineering program that is meant to lessen the quality of life and the life chances of a population. It is designed to constrain and engineer populations into oblivion. And the fact that we can't seem to get this, despite what's happening right now in Gaza, despite what's happening historically to practically every other oppressed people in the world, such as indigenous Americans, the fact that this is happening, this right-wing authoritarianism is happening throughout the world right now, in Europe, in the UK, in Canada, and America. What else can you say, brother? It's not a chance happening, right? This is the failure of Black academics who are both pessimistic and suspicious of the way that democracies operate and the way that white populations have operated across the face of the earth in multiple geographies, how their work and their insights weren't allowed to proliferate and become popular within the mainstream white liberal academy. Anybody with any sense saw that Trump was going to win again. Anybody with any sense saw that racism was on the rise. Hell, if you look at genocide scholars, they tell you the way that you know a genocide, the way you know a major conflict, genocide, or the at-large disenfranchisement of people's coming is that they started killing off their men. And we lived in America for a whole decade where I and other scholars are saying they're just assassinating Black men who are American citizens. They're just killing Black boys who are American citizens. That tells us about what's coming, because in every other conflict in the history of for the last 100-something years, they kill off men and boys as a basis to wage wars on whole populations. And America said, no, we're good. We're going to ride this kind of Hillary Clinton thing till the wheels fall off. We're going to try to make sure that we get a woman of color in the White House. And everybody, well, that's not really the issue, is it? Like, is it the issue? If a woman of color is in the White House, or if a white woman's in the White House, and Black people are still being incarcerated, being deported, being killed in the streets, losing homes, and falling into like a undercast or underclass, does it matter that the person that put them there is brown, or does it matter that they're being put there? You see, this is what I'm saying. The Black academic, many, however we want to frame that generalization, right? Many Black academics saw the rise of a certain kind of political theory and posture as the saving grace of Black people, not because it helped all Black people, not because it negated the environmental stressors that are causing Black children to learn differently or less than their counterparts, right? They appreciate it because it put them in a position of visibility, right? So when I left the United States, I understood that this was a rigged game, that this is what was coming, because I could think of no other example in history where this came and then disappeared. I don't think things are random. That's just not how I'm built. I'm a very historical thinker. So when Black people find themselves in this environment now, where you have white liberals that are diminishing black issues of racism for the overarching concerns of fascism, where you see a hostile white population that's anti-diversity, that wants to whitewash history, wants to whitewash every major institution, and now wants to whitewash American education like they do in France. I can't say that that's random. I can't explain why America and certain parts of Canada are both eliminating DEI, right? Canada has nothing to do with the United States. They don't support Trump at all, yet they're doing it. I can't explain why America makes a decision on DEI and the UK has, different banks, institutions, and corporations doing the same thing. I can't explain that. America's not the UK. I can't explain why it's happening in Europe. But what I can explain is a question. Does white nationalism, ethno-nationalism, does white capitalism, does white populations and their insecurities of increased diversification have a historical context to try to eliminate racial difference? Well, I could say yes to that. Why? Because all of history has told us that. Can I say that American democracy seems to function at its best when it is based on some kind of repressive regime of people who are not white in relation to those who are white? I can say that too. So when they say make America great again, what are they talking about? They're talking about the manufacturing, the capital, the corporations. They instill a strong cultural dominance, which is overwhelmingly white and Anglo-Saxon in the United States. Well, why would that then appeal to white people, even if they're poor, even if they're women? Because it protects their race more than it does the individual entities that politically differ from them. So as a black academic, we are fundamentally geared towards asking, well, how can we get into a system where the system is constantly trying to tell us that we shouldn't be part of it because we're an outsider, and we seek success not in the decimation of that system, not in that system or its destruction, but in our inclusion into it, even at the expense of other groups of people, because we don't have our own country. So we say that our investments in institutions that are American, that make us feel as if we're American, well, that's just the collateral cost. We have to lose some people. That's the wrong way to think about it, because as we see right now, right, the American situation of racism, of anti-blackness, puts black people in another relationship where we're out begging other groups of people to work on our behalf. We're begging Target. We're begging these other places. We're asking the Black Congressional Congress. We're hoping that Harvard wins this lawsuit so others will follow suit, so other universities can preserve our jobs and other corporations will recognize that they need diversity. We applaud people who are willing to include us because we don't control institutions ourselves, right? And we have nothing to say about the international reign of right-wing authoritarianism and the rise of nationalism across the globe, because it's just what happens to black people. And then in 10, 20 years, when this is over, we'll write books about the civil rights struggle of the 21st century, right? Don't we get tired, right? We overcame slavery, Reconstruction, right? 19th century civil rights movement, segregation, Jim Crow, right? Fighting for Civil Rights Act of 64, 20th century civil rights movement. Trump comes in, 21st century, destroys the civil rights movement, debunks DEI, affirmative action, Title VII, etc. No more affirmative action in admissions and hiring. Now the 21st century move will be to get back what we gained for the last 200 years. And we say that's a success, right? Come on, man. Come on. It's not serious. It's not serious. We let academic pontifications of progress that benefit a very, very small educated class of black people
I think
substitute for the benefits of others. And
I,
and it's, well, yeah, I mean, I'll just say that it's a misnomer for us to think that black academic production is helping masses of black people, because we've made theoretical or conceptual interventions into a way to rationalize our own subjugation and oppression.
after speaking to so many brilliant minds, I've come to the conclusion that people don't have an issue. Majority of people, they don't have an issue with the system. Their issue is with their position in the system.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So they don't have an issue with any injustices that's taking place. They
No,
just want to make sure they're on the other side.
no,
Um,
brother. Yeah, I agree with you, and I'll be honest with you. I mean, people, people have come to me, and try to place me in specific, pots. Well, you seem to make these criticisms about poverty. Are you a communist or a Marxist? Are you a, I mean, most people know I'm not a feminist, but maybe you could be liberal or, radical. Those things don't interest me, man. Like I'm not. I'm interested. This sounds cliche, but I am genuinely interested in truth. I want to know how societies function. I want to know what poverty costs us. That's why I'm so interested in how how populations get sick and how populations are dying, right? I'm interested in that stuff. So when I look at these things, I don't see the need for political pundits and pontifications about our condition. I'm saying, well, what is it that's repetitive? What do we see over and over and over again that happens? Like, we should learn from this moment instead of repeating it with the same kind of politics, the same kind of rhetoric, the same kind of protest. So yeah, I agree with you. I think the position that most people have within systems is the driving force behind how they define progress and whether or not they're content with the racial circumstances of the United States. But I think the larger issue is that we have lots of people suffering, lots of people who are going to die because we were wrong, right? And I think black intellectuals need to take stock of that we've been giving political theories and formulations of a world where we were wrong about what we could expect out of America. And now, instead of us admitting we're wrong, we're trying to pivot to the next thing that brings in money, the next thing that'll put us on MSNBC, right? I think it's disingenuous. I think our job is to be researchers and to try to find the truth, and that should be a very humbling and a very small attention seeking endeavor. But that's not how it works in the United States. I'm very happy to keep trying to find the truth and share my research, less so than my opinions of what I found. And if people prove me wrong, so be it. But I think that we have got to admit that our ideas have failed under the weight of history, and now we have to find new ideas.
Question I want to ask now is that I was reading an article you wrote, and looking through it, I came up with this question here: is that why is the history of male rape during traumatic events like the Holocaust and slavery often
Mhm.
overlooked? And what impact does acknowledging this history have?
Well, I think for a lot of people, this is a largely academic question. The academy is run by certain narratives that we call theory, and one of the narratives happens to be that men were not rapists, or were not raped; they were rapists. And the history of the domination of men in wars, conflict, genocides like the Holocaust simply don't attest to that. And in the academy, you can't chew gum and walk at the same time. So there's a view that if you focus on the rape of men at the hands of other groups of men and women during war and conflict, that's something that somehow takes away from the efforts to recognize women. And I find those kind of conversations boring. I think the real issue here is that you have a long history of suffering that black men especially endured during slavery, Jim Crow, even today at the hands of cops and police. You've had the rape of Jewish men during the Holocaust. You have the ongoing rape of Palestinian men now in Gaza by Israeli forces. Uh, what is important about that is it shows us the vulnerability that men and boys suffer, and it shows that we don't have the whole picture. So when we want to get up on our soapbox and start discussing who we think's oppressed, why we think they're oppressed, why certain groups suffer more than others, which seems like an endless conversation in the academy. It lets us know that we're missing something important. And the reason that we're missing that is not because it doesn't happen and because we don't have evidence of it, because we don't have survivors. We're that happens because we're too selfish to admit that our theories are incomplete. We define ourselves by the theoretical orientations of feminism, we define ourselves by certain beliefs in masculinity that rationalize a certain kind of racism. It is easier for us to believe that black men are beasts, savage, rapists who want to harm women, than understanding that they have been victimized, sodomized as victims of rape by older women, by their peers, or by systems and state agencies at large, like the heads of the police, etc. So the importance of it is that it shows us the vulnerability. It exposes the kind of violence that black men and other oppressed groups of men throughout the world suffer. And has been ignored because it challenges a fundamental crux of white supremacy, which is the view that black men are solely and almost only a physical and sexual threat to white women, children, and to the white race because it's a threat to their reproductive continuities.